Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. One signature. That's all it would take to make you the owner of a vast fortune, or the next victim in a curse that has consumed generations. This story isn't just a warning from the past, it's a premonition. Because right now, somewhere, a new will is being prepared. And your name could be next. Watch the full story before the inheritance finds its next heir. They say inheritance is a gift, a reward for bloodlines and loyalty. But in my family, inheritance feels more like a death sentence, one passed down with every will, every signature, every sealed envelope that should have never been opened. When I was named the last heir of the Carrow estate, I thought it was a mistake. I'd never met most of them, distant cousins, great-uncles, women whose portraits still hang in the East Corridor, their eyes dulled by time and varnish. Every one of them inherited something once. Land, money, a title, and every one of them died before 40. The house itself seems to remember. Its walls bow inward, heavy with secrets. The floors groan even when no one walks them. In the library, old ledgers record not only the assets of the family but the dates of funerals, written neatly beside each heir's name. As if someone, somewhere, expected the deaths to happen. Locals whisper about a curse that the first Carrow cheated his own brother out of the estate, sealing his fortune with blood and deceit. Since then, the fortune's grown, but the family has not. Now it's mined the house, the land, the accounts, the portraits that watch me wherever I go. Every document signed in my name feels heavier than it should, as though it's binding me to something far older than I can understand. I came here to claim my inheritance, but I think it's already claimed me. Inheritance, in its simplest form, is meant to be a continuation, a legacy handed down from one life to another. But when that gift becomes entwined with tragedy, it stops feeling like fortune and starts feeling like fate. The first point in this story opens with that unsettling contrast, how something meant to be a blessing can twist into a curse. The tone is crucial, it's not just about money or property, but the shadow of history that follows it. Every word is laced with quiet dread, as if the act of receiving something is also the act of accepting something dark and irreversible. The opening must immediately invite the listener into that space between inheritance and doom, where privilege blurs with punishment. It's an invitation to question what we think we know about luck and destiny, about whether wealth ever comes without a cost. The line that begins the story, "They say inheritance is a gift," serves as a misdirection. It mimics the comforting phrases people say at funerals or in family gatherings, but the next breath unravels it entirely. It exposes the illusion of safety that inheritance implies. This creates a haunting rhythm, comfort followed by corrosion, sweetness tainted with decay. The narration doesn't rush, it lingers, letting the listener feel the tension of something familiar turning unfamiliar. As the tone deepens, the focus shifts from the general idea of inheritance to the personal perspective of the narrator. This transition grounds the story in lived experience rather than superstition. It paints a picture of someone who never expected to inherit anything, someone who stands at the edge of an old family line now erased by time. Their disbelief isn't only in the sudden wealth, but in the strange pattern that came before it, every heir dying too soon, every will rewritten with eerie precision. The opening moment captures the instant when reality begins to blur. The fortune seems to glow with a kind of cursed allure. That tension creates the story's heartbeat, a reminder that what's inherited is not only tangible but spiritual, emotional, even spectral. The narrator's voice is calm but uneasy, as though speaking softly keeps the darkness from noticing. Each sentence builds a rhythm of inevitability, echoing the quiet horror of being chosen not for life, but for death. It's in this moment that inheritance transforms from a legal document into something supernatural, something binding. The weight of legacy becomes suffocating, the air thick with unspoken warnings, and the listener can sense that by the time the story ends, the price of inheriting everything will be far greater than anyone ever imagined. The sense of inevitability that hangs over this story defines its tone from the very start. It's not just that people died, it's that they were always going to. Point 2 explores this idea of fate as something quietly patient, something that doesn't chase its victims but simply waits for them. The narrator speaks as though trapped in a cycle too old to escape, a pattern stitched into the family's name long before they were born. The air of inevitability isn't loud or violent, it's subtle, like the ticking of a clock that everyone ignores until it stops. This approach transforms the narrative from a story about misfortune into one about destiny, a curse that doesn't scream, but whispers. The listener begins to understand that what happened to the previous heirs wasn't random. It followed an order, a rhythm, like the estate itself demanded payment for what it gave. The tone of inevitability is amplified through the estate's imagery. Every description reflects the same quiet doom, the ivy creeping up the cracked walls, the dust layered over portraits that seem to mourn themselves, the echoes that linger too long in empty halls. These aren't just aesthetic details, they're signs that the house itself has accepted the deaths as part of its nature. Time feels distorted there, as if each generation lives only long enough to inherit and die, leaving the house to absorb their silence. The narrator's words move slowly, weighed down by that realization. They are the next name on a list that's been written for centuries, and they know it. That knowledge gives the story its haunting stillness. Each heir's death isn't described in detail, because the real horror isn't how they died, it's that they all did. The lack of specifics builds unease, suggesting that death here doesn't need explanation, it simply happens, as expected. This fatalistic rhythm becomes the true antagonist of the story. It's not an entity or ghost, but the repetition of history itself, the idea that families can be cursed not by magic, but by their own greed, guilt, and the weight of inheritance. The narrator doesn't fight it outright. Instead, they speak as if trying to understand why they've been chosen to continue this legacy of endings. There's resignation in their tone, a soft tremor beneath each word, hinting that they've already accepted their place in the inevitable sequence. It's this slow surrender that deepens the dread, making it clear that the real curse isn't death, it's knowing it's coming, and carrying the quiet terror of waiting for it. The third key point introduces the narrator as the last and most unlikely heir, the one who stands at the edge of a family line already thinned by time and tragedy. This revelation shifts the story from mystery to personal dread, turning an old curse into something suddenly intimate. The narrator's voice carries both disbelief and reluctant acceptance, as though inheriting this estate feels less like being chosen and more like being cornered. They were never supposed to be next, too distant, too forgotten, perhaps even unaware of their own connection to this lineage. Yet, when the letter arrived or the lawyer called, it felt less like fortune and more like a summons. This framing gives the moment a sense of inevitability disguised as coincidence, as if the estate itself reached out to claim what remained of its bloodline. The narrator's arrival at the estate serves as a mirror to their confusion and unease. They step into a decaying world built by people they never knew, yet their name is carved into its foundation. Dust lies thick on the furniture, the air smells of iron and rain, and every portrait in the hallway seems to follow their movement. The walls seem to breathe in their presence, as though recognizing something familiar. This strange connection between the narrator and the house adds to the unsettling atmosphere. It's as if the blood in their veins resonates with the creaking timbers and whispering drafts. The listener begins to sense that being the last heir is not a privilege, but an appointment they cannot refuse. Emotionally, this point draws the audience closer to the narrator's isolation. Everyone before them is gone, and yet their memory lingers in objects, in fading letters, in the eerie organization of the will that keeps rewriting itself to reach the next of kin. The narrator doesn't belong to this lineage in spirit, yet is bound to it by blood, and that contradiction becomes a source of both fear and fascination. They walk through the halls of their inheritance knowing that it has consumed everyone before them, and that realization reshapes their perception of family, love, and survival. The wealth and grandeur that should inspire gratitude instead weigh on them like chains. The estate feels less like an inheritance and more like a waiting room between life and death. By the end of this moment, the narrator understands that they are not just the last heir, they are the final offering, the closing chapter in a legacy that refuses to die quietly, even as it takes the last of its blood to keep itself alive. The decaying ancestral estate stands as the physical embodiment of everything wrong with the family's legacy, a monument not of triumph, but of slow, deliberate collapse. In this story, the estate isn't merely a setting, it is a living relic, breathing with secrets and regret. Every crack in the plaster, every faded portrait, every locked room whispers of lives that once pulsed within its walls and ended too soon. The narrator's first encounter with it is drenched in unease, the air smells of mildew and old wood, the light struggles to break through heavy curtains, and somewhere deep within, a door always seems to be slightly ajar. The estate feels watchful, its silence too dense to be natural. It is as if the house itself is conscious of the deaths it has witnessed, carrying their memory within its structure. This decay mirrors the moral and emotional erosion of the bloodline that built it. The architecture speaks in metaphors, staircases that lead into shadows, portraits whose eyes seem too aware, and corridors that narrow with every step. These are not coincidences but reflections of a family history built on greed, secrets, and betrayal. The estate has absorbed it all, preserving it like a wound that never heals. For the narrator, every sound becomes a memory that isn't theirs. The echo of footsteps in the hall feels like the return of someone long buried, and each room tells a different story of love turned to suspicion, of fortune turned to fear. This creates an atmosphere of constant tension, where the house becomes both a sanctuary and a trap. The inheritance comes with walls that seem to close in the longer the narrator stays, a slow, suffocating reminder that everything grand eventually rots. Emotionally, the decay of the estate forces the narrator to confront the truth that what they've inherited is not wealth, but ruin. The mansion's grandeur is a deception. Beneath the carved wood and chandeliers lies rot, mold, and dust thick enough to hide entire histories. The beauty of the place is haunting, not because it's gone, but because it refuses to go completely. This resistance to collapse mirrors the curse itself, an unending cycle of survival through destruction. The narrator feels both drawn to restore it and repulsed by the thought of living inside it, as though any attempt to mend the house would mean mending the curse itself. The estate stands as a decaying soul, and in its reflection, the narrator sees the same fate waiting for them, to stand tall for a moment, beautiful and broken, before time and darkness claim them too. The portraits hanging along the walls of the ancestral estate are more than family heirlooms. They are silent witnesses, each one preserving the echo of a life cut short. In dim candlelight, the narrator studies their painted faces, unblinking eyes, still smiles, postures captured in a moment of pride or peace that feels impossibly out of place in such a mournful house. Yet beneath the varnish and dust lies something deeper, a kind of quiet accusation. Every portrait depicts an heir who inherited, and then died too soon. The narrator senses that these paintings were not meant to celebrate life but to record loss, each one added like another tally mark in the ledger of the cursed. The colors have faded unevenly, and when the light shifts, it almost looks as though the figures inside them are moving, not enough to be seen, but enough to be felt. The effect is subtle, unnerving, and inescapable. Standing in that corridor, the narrator feels surrounded by generations that never grew old. Some faces are young and defiant, others older and weary, as though they knew their time was limited. Each set of painted eyes seems to follow whoever passes, their gaze heavy with warning rather than affection. The artist's brush captured more than likeness, it caught despair, suspicion, and fear, the emotions that defined each life before it ended. There's an unspoken truth in their expressions, something like reluctant acceptance. It's as if the ancestors knew that the family's fortune carried a cost, and the portraits exist to remind whoever remains that no inheritance comes free. As the narrator lingers, details start to emerge that should be impossible. A faint resemblance between the living and the dead becomes undeniable, the same eyes, the same angle of the jaw, the same slight curve of a smile. In that recognition, the narrator feels the weight of destiny pressing closer, as if the portraits are a mirror reflecting not just the past, but the future. Each generation has left a piece of itself here, trapped in pigment and canvas, waiting for the next to take its place. The silence of the gallery becomes suffocating, heavy with stories that no one dared to speak aloud. Every step down the corridor feels like trespassing on sacred ground, where memory and malice intertwine. The narrator realizes that the estate doesn't need ghosts when its walls are filled with faces that remember. Those eyes, immortal and knowing, seem to ask the same question the narrator is too afraid to answer: how long before another portrait joins them? The sixth key point revolves around the eerie pattern that defines the family's history, the disturbing realization that every heir who inherited the estate met an early and inexplicable death. What begins as curiosity turns into obsession as the narrator starts noticing how each generation followed the same path: wealth, inheritance, and then an untimely end. The deaths are not sudden tragedies but part of an unseen rhythm, a dark symmetry that repeats itself through time. The narrator first learns of this through old documents, faded news clippings, and whispered remarks from locals who have grown too accustomed to the story to question it. Every obituary reads like an echo of the last, promising heirs taken young, families mourning in silence, and lawyers rewriting the will for the next in line. The pattern is too precise, too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. The more the narrator studies it, the more the details align with unnerving perfection. One heir drowned in the same river where another had vanished decades earlier. A different heir died in the master bedroom, the same one where her grandfather was found lifeless in his sleep. Time and circumstance change, but the outcome does not. It's as if the estate itself dictates who will die next, marking each heir before they even take possession of their inheritance. The narrator's rational mind searches for logical explanations: illness, bad luck, the weight of isolation in a decaying mansion, but nothing fits. The repetition is too clean, too intentional. The pattern doesn't feel human, it feels designed. Emotionally, this realization transforms the narrator's inheritance from a gift into a sentence. Each name on the family tree seems less like an ancestor and more like a predecessor in a long line of victims. The narrator begins to feel watched, as if unseen eyes are waiting for them to step into the same fate. The estate becomes a living timeline of tragedy, and every creak in the floorboards sounds like a countdown. The dread grows quieter but deeper, settling in the bones rather than the air. The narrator starts to wonder whether the curse is something supernatural or whether it's a punishment born of the family's own sins, a cycle of greed, betrayal, or violence repeating itself endlessly. What makes this pattern so horrifying isn't only the inevitability of death, but the calm precision of it. Every heir's story ends the same way, and now the narrator realizes that their own has already been written. They are simply living through the final chapter. Whispers of a curse weave through the family's history like smoke, faint but inescapable. The seventh key point explores how this curse became the only explanation anyone could cling to when reason failed. It began as a rumor among servants and townsfolk, a story passed quietly from one generation to the next, spoken only at night when the wind carried through the trees surrounding the estate. According to these stories, the first heir who founded the fortune did so through treachery. Some say he betrayed his own brother during a land dispute, falsifying documents and bribing witnesses until the entire estate became his. Others claim something darker, that blood was spilled, and the estate's very soil drank it in. Whatever the truth, every generation afterward bore the weight of that original sin. What began as gossip hardened into legend, and by the time the narrator arrives, the curse feels less like superstition and more like the family's inheritance itself. The curse is never described outright, it's sensed. A lingering heaviness in certain rooms, a chill that never fades, letters that seem to change wording when reread by candlelight. The locals refuse to approach the property after sunset, crossing themselves when the family name is mentioned. Even those who don't believe in curses speak of the Carrow estate with uneasy respect, as if acknowledging something old and watching. For the narrator, these whispers start as background noise, stories meant to frighten rather than explain. But the longer they stay, the harder it becomes to ignore the coincidences. Dreams grow vivid. Familiar voices echo from empty halls. The same candle that burns perfectly one night gutters and dies the next, though no draft can be found. The idea of the curse begins to change from myth to presence, a subtle force that shapes behavior and thought. The narrator starts to wonder if the curse requires belief to survive, if every retelling of the story keeps it alive. The fear becomes contagious, spreading quietly through the estate like mold, impossible to fully erase. Even rational thought begins to fracture as the narrator considers that perhaps this is how the curse truly works, by convincing its victims that they are doomed, ensuring that their every choice feeds the same inevitable outcome. The rumor of betrayal becomes a prophecy, and the curse becomes self-fulfilling. The more one resists it, the closer it seems to draw. And so the inheritance turns from wealth to burden, from family pride to family punishment, until the narrator can no longer tell whether they are living inside a haunted house or within the curse itself. The will is more than a legal document in this story. It's a living thing, rewritten again and again as if it refuses to die with its author. The eighth key point focuses on how each time an heir perishes, the will seems to evolve, adjusting itself almost automatically to name the next successor. This repetition becomes its own kind of haunting, an invisible hand ensuring the fortune never escapes the family, no matter how much blood has been spilled to keep it. The narrator learns of this from the estate's solicitor, a man whose eyes look older than his face, who speaks of the process with unease rather than professionalism. He describes how, through decades and deaths, the will has been revised but never changed, the same clauses, the same property transfers, the same conditions, as if written by someone who already knew how and when each heir would fall. The paper smells of rot and dust, its ink faded to a reddish brown, and yet it endures as though time refuses to touch it. The pattern within the will mirrors the pattern of deaths, both too precise to be coincidence. Every heir inherits the same three things: the house, the land, and the debt of memory. The narrator notices subtle handwriting changes between signatures, but the content remains eerily consistent. The document lists personal possessions long lost to time and names servants who no longer exist, as though it's anchored to the past, dragging each new generation back into its grasp. There are even marginal notes in unfamiliar handwriting, cryptic lines that don't belong in a legal record, phrases like asterisk they must stay within the grounds asterisk or asterisk the bloodline is the key. Asterisk each new heir signs without question, and each one dies before having time to alter it. The will's persistence becomes an omen. It feels as if the estate itself ensures its renewal, feeding on bureaucracy to maintain its control. The narrator begins to suspect that the act of signing it seals something beyond ownership, that the ink binds the living to the house in ways the law can't define. Each clause reads like a vow disguised as inheritance, and each signature like a surrender. The solicitor's hands tremble as he presents it, admitting that no one has ever successfully contested its terms. For the narrator, this realization transforms the will from a symbol of wealth into a document of doom. It carries the illusion of order, yet every word drips with inevitability. The narrator understands that the fortune they're about to claim is not being given freely. It's being passed on not because it's wanted, but because it demands someone to bear it next, and the will always finds a way to choose. The inheritance in this story is not a gift but a paradox, a thing of beauty wrapped in dread. The ninth key point captures that duality, the sense that to receive everything is to lose everything in return. When the narrator finally signs the papers and becomes the legal owner of the Caro estate, there's an initial moment of disbelief, almost wonder. They walk through rooms filled with priceless antiques, shelves lined with rare books, gold-framed mirrors reflecting light that feels centuries old. For a fleeting moment, it feels like stepping into history, as though every sacrifice made by generations before has led to this single moment of possession. Yet beneath that all lies an uneasiness that refuses to fade. The silence is too thick, the air too still, the wealth too heavy. The fortune they've inherited carries the same stillness as a grave. As the narrator explores further, the grandeur begins to feel like camouflage for something rotten. Each object tells two stories, one of craftsmanship and one of consequence. The piano in the drawing room hasn't been played in decades, yet its keys are dusted clean, as if touched by unseen hands. The chandeliers glimmer faintly even when the bulbs are off. The inheritance becomes both a physical space and a psychological maze, where every corridor leads to questions about what was truly earned and what was taken. The wealth feels cursed not because of superstition alone, but because it's built on the foundation of misdeeds. Every heir who enjoyed it paid with their life, and now the narrator stands at the center of that balance, understanding that fortune in this family has always been an exchange, not a reward. Emotionally, the moment of inheritance becomes suffocating. The narrator's gratitude turns into guilt, and their curiosity becomes fear. They begin to sense that the estate doesn't belong to them at all, that they belong to it. The house accepts them quietly, as if recognizing its new keeper, and the documents they've signed feel less like ownership and more like initiation. The very walls seem to breathe differently once their name joins the family records. They are rich beyond imagining, yet utterly powerless, trapped by the same invisible contract that took everyone before them. The wealth that others would envy feels more like a burden passed from corpse to corpse. What was meant to free them binds them instead, and as the narrator looks out across the decaying fields and endless horizon, they feel the weight of the inheritance settling in their chest, heavy and irreversible, as if the estate itself has finally found its next sacrifice. The silence of the house carries a presence of its own, dense and deliberate, as though it's listening rather than resting. In the 10th key point, this silence becomes the most powerful character in the story, not emptiness, but awareness. From the moment the narrator crosses the threshold of the Caro estate, the quiet feels unnatural. It isn't peaceful, it's oppressive, a living thing that presses against the walls and fills every pause in conversation. The narrator hears it differently at night, when the rest of the world sleeps and the house seems to wake. The creak of the floorboards, the distant thud of a closing door, the soft sigh of air through the old vents, all of it forms a kind of language the narrator can't yet understand. The silence is not broken by these sounds, it's defined by them. They are the heartbeat of a structure that remembers. At first, the narrator tries to rationalize it. Old houses make noise, the wind travels through cracks, the timber contracts with temperature. But each sound begins to repeat itself with unsettling precision, always at the same time, always in the same room. The tapping behind the walls starts just after midnight. The faint hum beneath the library floor grows louder when certain books are removed. A whisper, so soft it could be mistaken for memory, threads through the halls when the lights are extinguished. The silence amplifies these moments until they no longer feel like coincidences. The narrator begins to sense that the house isn't merely reacting to their presence, it's responding. Emotionally, this realization builds dread not through sudden fear, but through constant tension. The narrator becomes hyper-aware of every sound, every still moment between breaths. The silence begins to shape their thoughts, stretching time into long, uneasy hours where even the act of breathing feels intrusive. They start avoiding certain rooms, not because they're dark, but because they're too quiet, as if that silence could swallow them whole. At times, they speak aloud just to break it, their voice trembling in the vast, echoing halls. But the moment they stop, the quiet rushes back stronger, heavier, almost angry. It becomes clear that the estate's stillness is not absence, but a tension, a lingering watchfulness that has outlived every heir. The narrator realizes that this quiet is not meant to comfort, it's meant to contain. Something within the house is listening, patient and unseen, and its silence is a warning disguised as calm, reminding the narrator that in this place, even the quiet remembers the dead. After inheriting the estate, the first sign that something was deeply wrong appeared not in the mansion itself but in the air surrounding it. There was a heaviness that clung to every breath, a density that felt like walking through grief. The halls were lined with portraits of the deceased heirs, each painted in unsettling detail, their eyes gleaming with the kind of realism that made them seem alive. But the oddest thing was that each face seemed to have aged since the last time anyone saw the painting. It wasn't just a trick of the light or dust settling on varnish, people swore that the portraits had changed, ever so slightly, as if time continued to touch the canvas. One night, while inspecting the east wing, the new heir found an old phonograph still working, though no electricity was running through that part of the house. It played a faint, distorted voice repeating the same line over and over, "You're next to claim the promise." It wasn't clear whose voice it was, but it sounded eerily human, layered with something like static or distant breathing. From that night on, the heir began noticing strange patterns in the mansion, the creak of footsteps that matched their own, doors that shut themselves quietly as though obeying an unseen command, and whispers that echoed faintly through the floorboards whenever the clock struck midnight. Locals claimed that the mansion was built upon an old family vault, one that predated the first recorded heir, and that the land itself seemed to take back anyone who bore the Maddox name. The heir dismissed these as superstitions until they began finding claw marks on the inside of bedroom doors, deep gouges that were too deliberate to be made by animals. The strange part was that each door bore a different date, etched beneath the markings, dates that matched the exact nights when each previous heir had died. The more the heir tried to ignore the signs, the louder the house became. Windows rattled on windless nights, mirrors fogged over with words scribbled into the condensation, and the faint scent of burnt wood filled the air as though something unseen smoldered beneath the floors. When the heir finally found the family ledger hidden behind a false panel in the study, the final page was already filled in with their own name, date of birth, and an empty space where the date of death should have been. It wasn't written in ink but in something darker, the kind of stain that looked like it had seeped through the paper from somewhere beneath. The morning after discovering their own name in the ledger, the heir awoke to find the mansion subtly changed, as though the house itself had shifted during the night. The air was colder, the hallways seemed longer, and familiar rooms no longer connected in the same way. The heir's bedroom door now opened to a corridor that shouldn't have existed, one lined with mismatched wallpaper and portraits of people they didn't recognize. Each face bore a resemblance to the family line but was subtly distorted, mouths slightly too wide, eyes just a fraction too dark, and postures too rigid, like the subjects were forced to stand still for eternity. The air smelled faintly of old iron and perfume, a combination that clung to the back of the throat. The air tried to retrace their steps, but the layout of the mansion refused to obey logic. Doors led to nowhere, staircases ended at walls, and sometimes the same hallway appeared again no matter which direction they turned. What was once their home had become a maze, alive, breathing, rearranging itself. When the heir finally stumbled into the main foyer, the clock that had always been frozen at 3:17 now ticked again, each second echoing louder than the last. As it struck the hour, a figure appeared at the top of the staircase, a silhouette dressed in black, standing unnaturally still. It wasn't a ghostly vision or flicker of imagination. The heir saw its outline move, slow and deliberate, descending step by step as though rehearsing a familiar ritual. The figure's face remained hidden in shadow, but its presence felt suffocating, radiating the same coldness that lingered in the ledger room. Every light in the house dimmed at once, and the heir's reflection vanished from the nearest mirror. In its place stood another version of themselves, pale, expressionless, and watching from behind the glass with unsettling calm. It lifted its hand when they did, but a second slower, as if waiting to decide whether to follow or act on its own. Terrified, the heir turned away, only to hear soft laughter drifting from the direction of the parlor, where no one had been for decades. In that moment, the realization came that the mansion wasn't haunted by its former owners, it was preserving them, keeping them within its walls as part of itself. The ledger wasn't a record of death but a contract, a binding written into the very structure of the home. And now that the heir's name was inside it, the house had begun to claim them too. Every heartbeat, every echoing step, every shifting wall was the house tightening its hold, making sure they would never leave, not truly, not alive or dead. The heir began to sense that the house wasn't merely haunted, it was conscious, and its awareness was directed entirely at them. Every sound seemed amplified in its walls, every breath echoed as if the mansion itself was listening. They could no longer tell whether the creaking floors beneath their feet were caused by their own steps or by something moving just out of sight, pacing with them in perfect rhythm. At first, they tried to convince themselves it was grief or imagination, the aftershock of so many deaths in such proximity. But as days bled into nights without distinction, the boundary between thought and reality started to dissolve. The air in the house carried a low, pulsing vibration, almost like a heartbeat that didn't belong to any living being. When they pressed their ear against the walls, they could hear a steady thrum, faintly organic, as if the mansion had veins and chambers all its own. In their search for normalcy, the air tried to reoccupy the space, lighting fires, opening windows, inviting the daylight in, but the light never seemed to penetrate fully. Shadows moved independently, lingering in corners long after the sun had passed. Portraits appeared to shift expression depending on where they stood, and one in particular, a severe woman in mourning attire, always seemed to meet their gaze no matter the angle. One night, while attempting to sleep, the heir awoke to the sound of whispering directly above their bed. The voices spoke their name in unison, soft and rhythmic, like a lullaby meant to comfort and condemn at the same time. When they lit a candle, the sound stopped, but the air remained heavy, charged, as though the house itself had exhaled. The heir soon discovered that certain rooms refused to be entered. The doors would jam or open only to reveal blank walls where there had once been space. The dining room had become smaller overnight, its ceiling drooping slightly, pressing downward as if the room was inhaling. Objects moved between rooms with no explanation. A teacup left on the mantelpiece would later appear at the foot of their bed, or a clock that had stopped decades ago would suddenly begin ticking again in perfect sync with their pulse. Sleep brought no rest, only visions of corridors stretching endlessly, and each morning they awoke in a different part of the house. It became clear that the mansion was reshaping itself around their presence, testing their endurance, their sanity, their willingness to remain. It no longer felt like a home but a labyrinth of memories, some not their own, designed to confuse and consume. The heir understood, with a sinking dread, that the others who had inherited before them might have wandered these same shifting halls, slowly absorbed until nothing of their minds remained but whispers in the walls. The deeper the heir descended into the mansion's secrets, the more it became apparent that the house itself was a living monument to the family's sins. Behind a false wall in the east wing, they uncovered a narrow staircase leading to a hidden cellar that did not appear on any blueprint. The air was thick and cold, the kind that seemed to cling to skin rather than move around it. Candles sputtered as if protesting the intrusion, their flames bending toward the shadows instead of the light. At the bottom of the steps was a series of sealed rooms, small and silent, with initials carved crudely into their doors. Each one corresponded to a name in the ledger, each one an heir who had perished too soon. The realization struck like a chill through the bones. The mansion wasn't just holding their memories, it was storing their remains. In one of the chambers, the heir found remnants of ritual, chalk markings on the stone floor, rusted chains bolted to the wall, and symbols carved into the rock that looked older than the estate itself. Some were drawn in faded red, others burned into the surface, as if scorched by fire that never fully died. There were no bodies, but the air carried a faint metallic scent, the kind that comes from iron, decay, and old suffering. The air felt watched even in that stillness, the sensation of eyes following from somewhere beyond the reach of their candle's glow. Every step they took seemed to echo back too slowly, as if the sound had to pass through another layer of time before returning. Among the debris lay a single object that shouldn't have survived the years, a silver key wrapped in black ribbon, resting atop a child's toy box. When the heir picked it up, the whispering started again, this time from inside the walls. The voices were clearer now, speaking fragments of sentences that carried both warning and invitation. "You are the last," one said. "It must end where it began," murmured another. The air felt the ground beneath them pulse like a heartbeat, faint but undeniable, as though something vast and ancient lay dormant beneath the foundation. They fled the cellar, slamming the false wall shut behind them, but from that moment on, the rhythm of the house changed. Doors that had once creaked open now remained sealed, and the faint thumping beneath the floor became louder, steadier. The air could feel it even when standing still, a pulse syncing with their own. The discovery in the cellar had awakened something that had been waiting, a consciousness buried in the architecture, ancient and possessive, one that had long fed on the family's lineage to sustain its existence, and now it had fixed its hunger entirely on them. After the cellar's discovery, the heir began noticing that time inside the mansion no longer behaved the way it should. Clocks that had been broken for decades began ticking in reverse, their hands spinning endlessly as if trying to undo something that had already happened. The daylight outside the windows seemed dimmer than it should have been, even at noon, and sometimes when the heir looked out, they saw not the modern world but an older one, the estate grounds as they must have appeared a century ago, untouched by decay. Figures could be seen moving faintly through the mist beyond the glass, their forms indistinct, repeating motions like players in a broken film loop. When the air blinked, the vision would shift, and they would see themselves reflected in the window, but not as they were now. The reflection aged, changed, and stared back with a knowing expression that filled them with unease. Sleep became impossible. Each night brought a strange distortion of time, the hours stretched, folded, and rewound without reason. The air began hearing faint music, the same melody that had been described in the journals of one of the previous heirs before their death. A waltz, slow and deliberate, echoing through the halls without a source. When they followed it, they found the ballroom illuminated as it must have been decades ago. Chandeliers shimmered, dust vanished, and the air smelled of roses and smoke. Guests danced in pairs, faces blurred, yet every movement in perfect rhythm with the unseen orchestra. The heir stepped forward, and for a brief moment, one of the dancers turned toward them, an ancestor, unmistakably, her eyes hollow and glistening. She mouthed words the heir couldn't hear, but her expression was one of pleading. Then, just as quickly, the illusion snapped. The lights vanished, the room returned to ruin, and the heir was alone again, standing in silence that buzzed with residual energy. From then on, moments of the past began intruding into the present. The heir would walk into a room and find it as it had been in 1901, complete with the scent of burning wood and half-drunk tea on the table. Then, in a blink, it would crumble back to its present decay. The transitions were seamless, almost like the house was trying to merge its timelines. Each flicker brought the heir closer to the truth that the mansion wasn't bound by time at all, it was a vessel caught between eras, holding fragments of every life that had been lost within its walls. The family's deaths weren't random tragedies but echoes of the same event replaying over and over, seeking resolution that never came. And now, with the heir's name written in the ledger, the cycle had begun to fold inward, threatening to trap them in the same eternal loop that had claimed every generation before them. The heir's mind began to fracture under the weight of what the house revealed. Reality itself seemed to warp inside its walls, and it became impossible to tell where dreams ended and waking began. Every reflection, every sound, carried something just a little too familiar, an echo of thoughts that didn't belong to them. It started small, like hearing footsteps that matched their own or finding items they didn't remember touching rearranged into strange patterns. Then came the whispers, low and rhythmic, always circling the same words, "You belong here." The phrase followed them through every corridor, layered in different voices, men, women, even children, overlapping in tones of grief and command. It was as if the mansion had gathered every consciousness that ever lived or died within its bounds and now spoke through them as one. The heir tried to escape, but the outside world seemed to dissolve each time they reached the main gate. Paths curved back toward the house, and the surrounding forest shifted shape, branches bending to block their way. When they screamed for help, their voice didn't echo outward, it bounced back, muffled and warped, as though the air itself refused to let it leave. In the rare moments when they managed to sleep, the dreams were vivid and heavy with dread. They saw the previous heirs, each standing in the mansion's hall, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes weeping black tears that disappeared before reaching the floor. They whispered warnings too fragmented to understand, fragments like "don't sign again" and "the house feeds." Days began to blur. The heir couldn't tell how long they'd been there, hours, weeks, or something far longer. The house no longer felt solid but pulsed faintly beneath their touch, like something breathing just under the plaster. Rooms continued to rearrange themselves, guiding the heir toward spaces they'd never seen before. One such space was the attic, where they found portraits of every heir arranged in perfect order. Each canvas was painted with eerie precision, showing its subject not at their best but at their final moment. The last portrait was unfinished, blank, save for the outline of a face that looked unmistakably like their own. In that instant, the heir realized the mansion wasn't only preserving memories, it was constructing a lineage of possession. Every death had been a transfer, not an ending. The mansion needed a mind, a vessel, to maintain its presence, and each heir had served that purpose before being absorbed completely. Now, the house was empty again, waiting for them to surrender. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into something almost melodic, urging them toward acceptance, toward stillness, toward becoming another silent echo in its eternal collection. The heir began to sense that the mansion's hold on them was no longer confined to its walls. Even when they tried to think of life before the inheritance, the memories felt dimmed, as if light could no longer reach them. They would sit by the window and try to recall the sound of their old apartment, the color of the sky over the city, the laughter of a friend, but the images flickered and dissolved like paper burned to ash. It wasn't just that the house was consuming their sanity, it was replacing it. Every hour spent inside felt like a trade, giving up fragments of who they were in exchange for understanding what the house truly was. And with each revelation, the mansion seemed to grow stronger, more vibrant, as though feeding off the erosion of their will. One night, the heir noticed a faint humming coming from beneath the floorboards, deeper and more rhythmic than before. When they pressed their ear to the ground, it wasn't just sound, it was a heartbeat, slow and steady, echoing their own pulse. The walls seemed to breathe with it, expanding and contracting in the faint candlelight. The air was electric, heavy with something that felt like anticipation. Then came the dreams, visions so real they woke with the taste of dust and blood in their mouth. They saw a gathering of their ancestors in the great hall, standing in a circle, holding hands around a sigil burned into the floor. Their mouths moved, chanting words in a language that didn't belong to any era, and at the center of the symbol lay a figure identical to them, motionless, as though waiting to awaken. Each time the heir awoke, the chant lingered faintly in the corners of the room, as if the dream had spilled into the waking world. They began to understand that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by itself. Every soul that had lived there had become a part of its structure, their consciousness interwoven into the wood and stone. The family's wealth and longevity had not been coincidence but the result of a pact struck generations ago, a ritual of inheritance that demanded more than signatures and seals. It demanded submission. The house would grant fortune, power, and memory, but in return, each heir was bound to it, body and soul, until the next successor arrived to take their place. The heir realized too late that the cycle had already begun. The heartbeat beneath the floor grew louder, stronger, synchronizing with their own until they could no longer distinguish between the two. Every breath they took seemed to echo through the mansion, and every creak of the walls matched the rhythm of their pulse. The house was merging with them, absorbing them the way it had done with all who came before. And somewhere deep beneath the foundation, something ancient stirred in satisfaction, whispering through the stone, welcoming them home. The heir could no longer tell where their body ended and the house began. The days had become an indistinguishable haze of flickering light, shifting corridors, and whispers that spoke directly inside their thoughts rather than to their ears. When they reached out to touch the walls, the surface felt warm, alive, and sometimes it seemed to respond, pulsing faintly beneath their fingertips like a living organism. Their reflection in the mirror was no longer consistent. Some mornings, they looked younger, others, older, with features subtly altered to resemble the portraits of their ancestors. The realization came slowly, but undeniably, the house was reshaping them, molding them into something familiar, something it remembered. It wasn't just feeding on their mind, it was reconstructing their very existence to ensure continuity, to preserve its legacy in human form. They began hearing voices more distinctly now, no longer whispers but conversations happening just beyond the visible world. When they entered a room, the voices would stop, leaving only the faint echo of laughter or weeping. The air grew thicker, the temperature shifting from freezing to feverish within seconds. The mansion seemed to breathe in sync with their emotions. When they felt panic, doors slammed. When they felt sorrow, rain pounded the windows. When they stood still in resignation, the silence grew unbearable, pressing against their chest like a physical weight. Sleep became an act of surrender. Each time they drifted off, they awoke in a different place, dressed in clothes they didn't recognize, surrounded by artifacts from decades past. It was as though they were living the lives of those who came before, trapped in fragments of their ancestors' memories, reliving every death, every choice that had bound the family to the house. In one of those nights, they found themselves standing in the old chapel, though they had never been there before. Candles burned with black flames, their smoke rising in perfect spirals. The altar bore an ancient crest, the same symbol found carved in the cellar's floor, and behind it hung a tapestry depicting a faceless figure seated upon a throne of roots and bones. As they stared, the figure's head turned toward them, though it had no eyes to see. A voice filled the chapel, low and resonant, telling them that the inheritance was complete, that the bloodline had returned to its origin. The air fell to their knees as a deep vibration coursed through the ground, and they could feel the walls of the house trembling, not in collapse, but in awakening. The mansion's energy surged, flowing through every beam and stone, binding their heartbeat to its own. They realized then that they were no longer the heir. They were the vessel, the continuation, the living embodiment of the house's will, destined to guard it until another bloodline successor arrived to take their place in its eternal cycle. The transformation was almost complete, though the heir could no longer think of themselves as entirely human. The days had ceased to exist in sequence, time had folded in on itself, looping endlessly through dawns that never came and nights that refused to end. Their reflection in the window no longer mirrored them, it moved independently, lagging behind, smiling when they did not. The house had absorbed their rhythm, their breath, their thoughts, until it became impossible to tell which impulses were their own and which belonged to the mansion. The voices were no longer whispers but commands, spoken in the tones of every ancestor that had perished within these walls. Each one urged them to accept what had always been destined, the role of caretaker, protector, and prisoner of the estate. Resistance only deepened the house's hold, drawing their consciousness deeper into its framework, until their mind began to drift like dust in a closed room. The mansion began to change physically around them as if responding to their surrender. The decay reversed itself, floorboards smoothing, paint brightening, chandeliers glowing with restored brilliance. The air no longer smelled of rot but of lilac and polished wood, as though time had rewound to its grandest days. But beneath the beauty was something monstrous, a perfection too precise, too deliberate, like a mask concealing a grin. Every restoration came with a cost. A piece of the heir's memory faded, replaced by fragments from those who had come before. They could now recall events from centuries past, banquets, betrayals, funerals, as though they had lived them all. Their body carried the exhaustion of 100 lifetimes. Their reflection aged and aged in cycles, mirroring every heir who had ever stood where they stood. In the dead of night, the mansion finally spoke clearly, not through whispers or dreams, but through the architecture itself. The walls trembled with sound, the chandeliers swayed, and the doors flung open in unison. The voice that emerged was both many and one, echoing from the foundations upward, declaring the ritual complete. The air felt their pulse synchronize perfectly with the rhythmic thrum beneath the floor, a deep, resonant sound like the beating of a colossal heart. The walls glowed faintly, as though filled with veins of light, and the house exhaled for the first time in decades. The heir's body grew still. Their eyes lost focus, replaced by calm understanding, as though they had become part of something vast and unending. The mansion had absorbed them fully, not as a victim but as its newest consciousness, the latest mind to join its eternal chorus. The inheritance was no longer about wealth or property, it was about permanence, the merging of flesh and memory into a structure that would never die, forever whispering through stone and wood, waiting patiently for the next heir to answer its call. Years passed, or perhaps only moments, the heir could no longer tell. Time within the mansion had become irrelevant, a quiet ocean that ebbed and flowed around them, carrying fragments of voices, memories, and faint laughter that no longer belonged to the living. They could sense the world outside, distant and muted, as though viewed through heavy glass. The village that once feared the estate went on, generation after generation, whispering about the curse that followed those who entered its gates. But inside, the mansion thrived in its unnatural stillness. The heir's presence sustained it. Their consciousness had become woven into the grain of the wood, the hum of the pipes, the rustle of curtains that no longer needed wind to move. They existed in every shadow and whisper, watching as life outside the iron gates changed while they remained untouched by decay or time. Occasionally, wanderers came, historians, thrill-seekers, or distant relatives drawn by the legend of the inheritance. Each one crossed the threshold with curiosity and unease, sensing the strange warmth in the air, the faint hum beneath their feet. The house welcomed them silently, doors opening on their own, dust motes glittering like tiny stars in the filtered light. To these intruders, the mansion appeared empty, but the air carried a presence, something aware, observing, measuring their worth. The air, now more spirit than being, felt every footstep, every whisper spoken within the halls. They could feel the pulse of fear in those who trespassed, the quickening of hearts when portraits seemed to watch or when a door shut softly behind them. It was not malice that moved the house now, it was hunger, the same ancient hunger that had preserved it for centuries, searching for a new name, a new heir to bear its legacy. In the grand foyer, the old ledger still rested on its pedestal, untouched by dust. Its pages were yellowed, but one remained blank, waiting patiently. The ink bottle beside it never dried, and the quill never dulled. When a visitor lingered too long, drawn to its quiet invitation, the house would shift almost imperceptibly, the air thickening, the floorboards whispering their name. The air could feel it each time, the mansion stirring with anticipation, the echo of countless voices murmuring approval. All it needed was a signature, one line written freely, binding another soul to the cycle that had endured for generations. The air could not stop it. They were part of the mechanism now, guardians and accomplices of the curse that had made them eternal. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a heartbeat pulsed once, slow and steady, as the walls listened for the sound of a pen scratching against paper, the birth cry of the next keeper of the Maddox estate. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit that bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.